All right. Well, welcome back to our Africa Americas Forum on China. And the next panel has to do with security and law enforcement. China's security footprint in Africa and Latin America and the Caribbean is deepening. Beijing's global security initiative is now being actively promoted to African and Latin American stakeholders, including recent briefings at the African Union, as an alternative to Western-led security architectures. In parallel, both regions are confronting the rise of Chinese-linked transnational criminal networks involved in money laundering, drug trafficking, illegal mining, wildlife crime, and human smuggling. These dynamics create new vulnerabilities, but also new opportunities for cooperation among African, Latin American, Caribbean, and extra-regional law enforcement agencies. So this panel will unpack concrete cases where Chinese commercial or security presence intersect with all this. And our panelist is Paul Nantulia of the National Defense University Center for African Security Studies, Arhin Anchimpong of the Afro-Sino Center for International Relations. He is joining us virtually. Dr. Jim Markworth, Johns Hopkins SAIS, and of course yours truly. And we are joined by the moderator, Dr. Reynaldo Ortiz-Minaya of Howard University.
Good afternoon, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, great. So once again, I'm Dr. Ortiz-Minaya. Welcome, welcome back for our second session this afternoon. So this is a quite unique panel in the sense that it cuts across all of the other thematic foci we have been discussing thus far. For sake of time, which I know we're going to run out of time, I want to quickly introduce our panels. But before we begin, gentlemen, I want to highlight perhaps the importance of how we're perceiving the increase of Chinese illegal activity in the Caribbean region and Latin America. And for that, I want to jump right in. I'm going to merge some of these questions given our time constraint. So the first one, in your assessment, where do Chinese commercial activities, state-to-state security cooperation, and transnational criminal networks most frequently intersect? And why do these spaces remain so hard to govern? And related to that, in your assessment, how should African and Latin American policymakers assess China's global security initiative in practical terms as capacity building, strategic hedging, or a challenge to existing security partnerships?
Well, thank you very much. It's an honor to be here. That's a very long question. There's a lot of parts to that. So I'm just going to start broadly and maybe describe, for those that are not as familiar, kind of what the security situation is like in Latin America. And, you know, in some context, people look at Latin America and say it's the zone of peace. There's no state-on-state war. But then you look at it from another dimension. Homicides accounts for 8% of the global population and about a third of the homicides of the world. So, you know, there's a uniqueness in the security situation in Latin America, maybe as would relate to other countries around the world. Now, what I would say is if we look at, you know, okay, there's a lot of homicides. What does that mean? What does that landscape look like? I would break it down very generally, just, you know, for the sake of time, into really two kind of typologies, right? You have, you know, generally speaking, your cartels, you know, like the Sinaloa cartel or the Clan del Golfo in Colombia, or, you know, that are traditionally market oriented. And a lot of it is narcotics, you know, what we've traditionally known, but they've ventured into other areas such as illicit mining, and then there's a host of other human smuggling and a host of other activities. But these are, if you will, kind of, you know, more business oriented, you know, illicit organizations. And then you have the other ones, kind of like gangs, which are more identity based. So if you think of like MS-13, you know, that kind of falls in there. there's PCC in Brazil, there's Choneros and Lobos in Ecuador. And what's happening now is there's a little bit of a convergence in which, they were very distinct. They were focused on different operations, but that's changing largely because the flow of drugs is no longer just oriented south and north, but it's oriented across the world. In Europe and Africa and Asia, even in Latin America, there's starting to be drug addiction problems that did not used to be the case even as recently as 10 years ago. And so there's a whole change. Now there are other actors, other cartels from around the world. They're also involved partnering with some of these groups in Latin America. So there's a little bit of convergence, and there's another phenomenon that's going on that's not related, which is immigration, which is 8 million migrants have left Venezuela. So it's not unrelated. However, in people's mind in Latin America, they are connected. Now, IDB has proved that this is not the case. The American Development Bank did a survey last year, I believe, that showed that there's no connection between the two. But nonetheless, that doesn't change public perception. And this is important to understand how dynamics in the region are changing. So, for example, there's this poll, and I'll pull out the numbers from Chile. And so, Venezuela migrants, about 1.5 million are in Chile right now, 2 million roughly in Peru, 3 million in Colombia. And so Latina Barometro did a poll back in 2018 to ask people whether or not they thought the rise in crime was associated with migrants. And so in 2018, 31% believed that was the case. In 2021, they did the same survey, 56% thought that was the case. And in 2024, they did the exact survey again, and 77% believed, again, even if it wasn't true, they believed that the increase in crime was associated with migration. Why does this matter? This is not just happening in Chile, this is happening across the region. And you see the shift in more of a focus in insecurity as a primary political initiative. And so just look at the elections in Chile that just happened. You had a right-leaning president win. You've seen the same thing play out in Bolivia, the same thing play out in Honduras, in Costa Rica. We have upcoming elections in Colombia. We have upcoming elections in Peru. So there's this big shift going on. And many believe that the model that works to solve this problem is Bukele's mano dura policy in El Salvador. So that's kind of the background of what's going on. So where does China fit into this? Well, so the U.S. has always had very strong military ties. Security cooperation, security assistance program, very, very developed, very robust in the region. But now when you come into law enforcement, there's a little bit of a gap there. And China is trying to fill that gap. And one of their narratives is really saying this, is, really you're going to trust Americans for law enforcement? In the United States, they have problems with mass school shootings. We don't have that problem. So it's a very, very sticky kind of message. So what exactly is China doing? Their global security initiative is focused a little more in Latin America. And I'll break it down into kind of 4 areas. There's one way of breaking it down, right? They're doing regular law enforcement equipping, such as helmets, body armor, whatnot, equipment that police forces need. Then they're leaning on surveillance technology and equipment. So that's a second kind of pillar. I throw in police training as the third pillar. And then the fourth one is multinational bilateral agreements to do joint patrols and whatnot. So let me just briefly go through each one of those and how they stand with them. In the first one, which is traditional equipping, bullets, whatnot, there are several cases out there. I think Panama, they just recently provided them with like 6,000 helmets. But what's unique about what China is doing is they're not necessarily just going to the national level. If not, they're even going to local level police or low level police agencies throughout the region. And so they have it in there in a way that the United States has not really traditionally operated in terms of their security assistance. The second one, which I think is usually the more concerning one, is their surveillance technology and equipment. And so in this one, I'd break it down into programs that individual companies are doing, such as Huawei and their smart city program, and then other larger initiatives on behalf of the government. And so one of the big things they've initiated is helping different countries set up their own 911 system. So they did something similar to that in Ecuador. They did something similar to that in Bolivia as well, and not just at the national level. In Argentina, they've done it in specific provinces as well. And so this comes with a complement of not just they have operators in the 911 system, but a whole system of surveillance equipment, facial recognition and whatnot. And so I'd say that that one is a little more the worrying. The fourth one, which is specifically police training, so either trying to bring police to China or Chinese going into different countries and helping train their police. There are some cases. I think there's a claim recently that China trained up to 2,700 police members in Latin America over the last year. It's not necessarily easy to verify if that's the case or not. So those, I would argue, that's where the smaller inroads are. The one where they've had probably the least effectiveness today is developing regional agreements for doing joint policing and whatnot. They've been able to do that at the bilateral level to some extent, countries like Panama, Argentina. But again, that's part of their new initiatives under the Global Security Initiative. All this to say, the last question is, where does the United States stand on all of this? This is an area where the United States is not traditionally strong in law enforcement. You have INL under the State Department that does do some initiatives. In the past, in Central America, there was a really strong, going back last decade, anti-gang program under USAID. But generally speaking, it's not as robust and well organized as you look at DoD's security cooperation programs that have a number of different initiatives, including FMF, FMS, and whatnot. And so I think that's really where one opportunity lies. The other opportunity, I think, lies within Latin America itself and their regional bodies, such as the OAS, such as the OAS specifically, and some of the treaties that they have that are not necessarily being leveraged. And so there are some opportunities there, I believe, also. Thanks.
Thank you, Jim. Leland, before I pass it on to you, if you can also in your intervention speak to, in your assessment, some of the linkages or perhaps some of the things that are not being focused on in relation to the control of ports, and specifically those being partly drug trafficking points all across the Latin American region, and also taking into account the alleged involvement of Albanian TCNOs, transnational organized crime, in the assassination of the presidential candidate in Ecuador. So,
well, I first want to mention Chinese strategic aims globally. And this is written in Chinese strategic documents, right? This idea of creating what they call strategic support points. And what are those? They are areas or infrastructure projects around the world that can be used for both commercial purposes, but also as ways to increase the power projection of the People's Liberation Army. And so some areas like ports could be considered strategic support points. And there's, of course, a concern on the part of some clients like Department of War, U.S. law enforcement, and others that some of these kind of port infrastructure projects that are in this region can be used as strategic support points if there was ever a conflict between the U.S. and China, say over the Straits of Taiwan. Whether there's a direct tie between the ownership of Chinese ports and whether those ports are then used for illicit activities, I haven't necessarily seen that kind of specific hardcore evidence of that. I think that really any port that has weak governance, that is quite porous, will be used or leveraged by transnational criminal organizations from any country, regardless, right? But I did want to mention this rise in what we see as global criminal activity on the part of individuals that are of Chinese descent, right? And I'm being very specific on the way to describe that, right? Because we don't want to sort of demonize, say that somehow there's Chinese transnational criminal organizations that are run by the Chinese state. I don't think that that's happening. But what we are seeing is the rise of, again, these networks that are run by individuals of Chinese descent that are engaged in digital scam farms in Myanmar, what's called Philippine online gaming operations in the Philippines and various other Southeast Asian countries. And it's not just the digital scams, it's the money laundering, it is the selling of fentanyl precursors, it is the selling of wildlife trafficking. And what is concerning is that over the past few years, let's say 5 years or so, there's been increasing examples of this kinds of activity happening in the Western Hemisphere. Chile, Jamaica, Trinidad and Tobago, Mexico, of course. There was a key issue or news report just this past October of a man by the name of Zhang Zhidong, who was arrested in Cuba, actually, and sort of extradited to the United States. But he ran a large multi-million-dollar operation where he was not just facilitating the selling of fentanyl precursors to the Sinaloa cartel and Jalisco Nueva Generación in Mexico, but he was also engaged in money laundering and all the other activities that I mentioned, and he was leveraging contacts that he had within China in order to facilitate that. And so this is definitely an issue that's continuing to increase in prominence. Local Latin American and Caribbean security forces and law enforcement agencies are realizing this. And I think that actually it's going to create more and more of a demand for Chinese security cooperation in order to deal with it. And we already know from the China CELAC Joint Action Plan that was released in May of last year, and their white paper that was released in December of last year, both say that law enforcement engagement is a key pillar that the Chinese want to increase in this region, and that they actually listed out the very illicit activities that they want to deal with, which are the ones that Chinese criminal activities are in: the money laundering, the wildlife trafficking, and so on and so forth. Thank you. Thank you.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much. And it's great to be on a panel with you. And it's a very distinguished panel. So I'm really honored and privileged. I've worked with these gentlemen for years and years. So this is great. Look, let me begin by just framing, the strategic level framing. Now, first of all, I'm talking as an independent analyst, so I'm not conveying the views of the U.S. government or the Department of Defense. I just want to put that out there. But let me start by doing a larger framing of Africa within China, within Chinese security strategy. One of the things that I emphasize is that Africa is not peripheral to Chinese security strategy. It is central. I'll give an example. We all recall the military exercise that the People's Liberation Army conducted around Taiwan in December. This was by far the largest exercise we've ever seen. If you look at some of the vessels that were involved in this operation, some of them appeared in Mombasa in December, Mombasa, Kenya, and then in South Africa for the joint South Africa, China, Iran, Russian military exercise. Right? The People's Liberation Army Navy has been conducting anti-piracy patrols in the Gulf of Aden off the Somali coast since 2008. Right? Each time they will deploy a frigate, a destroyer, and a comprehensive supply ship. Now, if you look at the commands, the theater commands that are sending these forces and equipment out, it is the Eastern Theater Command, which is responsible for Taiwan. The Southern Theater Command, that is responsible for pressing Chinese claims in the South China Sea. And then you have the Northern Command, which is, Mongolia and so on. But these two commands that I've mentioned, the Southern Theater Command and the Eastern Theater Command, those commands have been sending, the vast majority of these elements. When you look at the fact that every African country, apart from Eswatini, formally recognizes Chinese claims in the South China Sea, including the nine dash line, and formally recognize the PRC as opposed to Taipei, then you begin to realize that Africa, in terms of the Chinese thinking, the Chinese strategic thinking, Africa is not peripheral. Africa is very central to how they think about the world. From a security and military perspective, which is what I cover in my research, African forces, certainly since the end of the 1990s and in 2000 when the Forum for China-Africa Cooperation was established. By the way, FOCAC is China's oldest mechanism for regional engagement. China's CELAC was formed in 2014, 2016. FOCAC has been there since 2000, right? It's the oldest. And all these other mechanisms that the Chinese are using to engage and to deepen their engagement with other world regions are actually modeled after FOCAC. And Leland and I have worked on this together. When you look at the China Latin America plan, for instance, and you mentioned that law enforcement is absolutely critical and internal security is absolutely critical. This is almost identical with the FOCAC Africa-China plan, the latest one, which was published in 2024, right? So China is basically learning and shifting lessons from region to region. Going back to my point of engagement, African military forces and military professionals interact more with the People's Republic of China than they do any other industrialized country. That is in terms of training, that is in terms of capacity building, in terms of what we call capacity building. That is in terms of professional military education, right? And all these other areas of engagement, right? The African forces, and even in a peacekeeping environment, if you were to talk to an African military peacekeeper and ask, who are you most likely going to be in the trenches with in a peacekeeping operation in Abyei, in Darfur? They'll most likely tell you People's Liberation Army. When I visited China in 2024, on the sidelines of the FOCAC summit, on TDY with the US Embassy, we had an opportunity to interact with Chinese military and to ask. And it was very interesting. The response was also very telling in terms of Chinese thinking, that this is considered extremely important. This interaction with African military is considered extremely important. Why? It, number one, exposes the PLA to working in foreign environments, exposes the PLA to interoperability, and exposes the PLA to being able to project force outside the Chinese periphery. Now, these deployments that I was talking about earlier, 48 so far since 2008, these are the first operations of the PLA outside the Western Pacific, right? So we begin to see how central Africa is to these different efforts. Now, when it comes to police and law enforcement, we see that the Ministry of Public Security, which is the entity that is responsible for law enforcement and all that good stuff, has more interactions with African governments and with African forces than even the PLA. And PLA engagement is already very high, as we mentioned, right? So police training, memorandums of understanding, extradition agreements, and that sort of thing, right? A lot of it might go under the radar because, nobody is going to monitor what the Ministry of Public Security is doing, police engagement, police and, those sorts of areas tend to be less sexy than mill to mill. And because of that, no one is really paying attention to it. But more and more African countries are engaging in these activities. I was in Tanzania last year at one of the political schools that was built by the Chinese, which is modeled after the Central Party School. And talking to some of the individuals over there, I wanted to find out basically why are African countries seeking out the PRC as a police partner, police and law enforcement? Very important for this conversation. We could basically break it down into four. One, there is similarity and affinity, a lot of affinity, in the way African police forces are structured and the way Chinese police forces are structured. In most of the time, African police forces are going to be part of the executive branch. They're going to be part of the regime's enforcement machinery. Most of the times, police forces operate on the same ranking system as the military. So they are highly militarized, right? This is almost a mirror image of how the People's Armed Police operates. So when the People's Armed Police officers and African police officers are meeting, they're basically talking the same language, right? The US model of policing is extremely different. It's decentralized, it's not in the executive branch, and all these things that I've mentioned. Very important point. The second is some countries are simply looking for regime enforcement capacity. China happens to be the best partner when it comes to that kind of thing. It's just as simple as that. Third element is there's some countries that are genuinely looking for capacity. And what the Chinese are able to offer is scale, but at low cost and on favorable terms, right? Comparatively speaking. So they might prefer to work with other partners, but what the Chinese are offering is scale and low cost, right? And then the fourth element is if a country is trying to enjoin the Chinese government on things like loans, things like infrastructure support and all that, one way to get Chinese attention and to keep that attention is to become open to receiving that kind of security assistance. So there's also a political calculation to it. When it comes to the illicit activity, there's certainly a lot of examples that can be used, especially when it comes to the use of Chinese security firms. We've seen, there's an example in Zimbabwe of a citizen that was shot by a Chinese guard. We've seen that in Zambian mines, for instance, when there are problems around labor and pay and stuff like that, and where Chinese managers or security firms have shot at Zambian miners. So we see that as a problem. But it's difficult to draw a link between this activity and whether it is sanctioned by the Chinese government. I'll give an example. The former Chinese ambassador to Tanzania wrote a very interesting piece that you should all read. And he was basically saying that every time he walked into his office in the morning, he was just absolutely anxious, reading a Tanzanian paper and just hoping against hope that a story involving Chinese smuggling of ivory would not be on the front page, because a lot of consular time was spent trying to deal with that particular problem. So certainly there are lots of problems, very difficult to establish a direct link with the Chinese government. But I want us to think about the strategic picture of the depth of interaction which is well documented, of African and Chinese forces, and the reasons why African countries are choosing China as a security partner, both on the military to military side and also on the police side. And we should also talk about intelligence and paramilitary work. So this is what I would say.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Paul. We're going to definitely come back to that, especially because I'd like to see how you perceive the similar activities from the MPS in the Latin American region, or if you see a difference in terms of how they're operationalizing these initiatives. Mr. Aldin, are you with us, sir? Mr. Aldin?
Yes, I am. I'm here. I don't know if you can.
Yes, we can. So go ahead.
Yes. So after everything Mr. Paul Nantuya has said, I'm really struggling with what else to add. Thank you for that very extensive presentation. I want to talk about again the gray areas where some of the issues intersect. Definitely, as some of the panelists have said, definitely the port, and you see that most of these things you mentioned, China has a program that seeks to support this and backing to be well in this system. So, for example, you take global maritime infrastructure, you see that China is doing so much in terms of building a port, and all of this is an initiative. You can talk about the digital infrastructure, which is also captured, Silk Road, and lastly, you talk about the extraction of natural resources, and where these intersect, you will see that there's an overlap when it comes to legal trade and also illicit markets, right? So, for example, you take the port, you're going to be looking at security issues like human trafficking, you know, movement of goods and declaration goods and of goods into African ports. You are areas as well. And then that is where we talk about the underground banks that are illicit, that support illicit financial flows, usually in China and out of China. And also, finally, we talk about the extraction of resources that has to do, for example, in places like Ghana. You're talking about the Galamsey crisis and how that is also used to launder money and other things. But to look at the issue of the criminal groups that operate, mostly you're not going to find some criminal groups like you see, like the 14K group in China operating in maybe some parts of the Latin American countries. The challenge that we find in our work is that if you look at most countries in Africa, as Paul rightly mentioned, there's huge lack of capacity. In addition to that, we have the issue of political will, to actually address some of these security issues that the West are so concerned about. Because as Paul again said, some of these political will is as a result of what these countries get from all of these security infrastructure that China is providing for regime, to maintain their regimes and to keep their regimes functioning. So this makes it very, very difficult, and also to create that description of these activities as, say, criminal, or even for countries to see them or view them as security issues. And so once the country does not see these things or recognize them as security issues, it becomes very, very difficult to look at ways to collaborate to address the security issues as one may put them. Also, you will find that, for example, when it comes to the issue of partnership or collaboration between African security agencies and Chinese agencies, as Paul rightly said, you will see that under the FOCAC, there's been a lot of activity and a lot of work around, training, which come in as, very, I want to use the word, not too aggressive, and a very seamless way to engage. And definitely, most African countries need these partnerships to also build the capacity. So it makes it really difficult to view Chinese activities in the country or Chinese activity within a sub-region as purely security challenges in the sense, and to get governments to have a position to really fight them, or to see that as a security issue that they need to put in measures and mechanisms to fight. I think this is also the case because sometimes, even if they recognize or they see this as security challenges, most governments on the continent do not even have the capacity to fight it in the first place. I've mentioned all these issues, especially with money laundering. I've mentioned the issue of the underground banks. Most, for some work that we did, you find out that most countries do not even realize that these underground banks exist, and this bypass of banking systems within countries actually exist. What some countries have done, and a classical example would be Ghana, has done is, for example, when it comes to extraction of natural resources, because the country could not address the issue of Chinese actors or foreign actors coming to do illegal mining and taking the gold out, smuggling it out. What they did was the country taking over the entire value chain of gold, of gold extraction in the country, from
You may want to try shutting off your video, sir. So we're going to come back to the panelists, and then once he comes in. So, well, thank you for a rather in-depth introduction into the landscape. I want to shift the conversation a bit towards looking at on-the-ground law enforcement tools, if you will, and specifically which instruments in your assessment, MLATs or beneficial ownership registries, in your interpretation have proven most effective in addressing Chinese-linked illicit activity, and more specifically, what are the biggest enforcement gaps in the regions?
Yeah.
Okay, I can.
Aline, are you there?
Yes, I'm here.
Yes.
If you don't mind me,
you may want to shut off your video. That's going to increase the bandwidth. It might be easier.
Sounds good. Do this. Yes, is it okay now?
Yes.
Awesome. So I was saying that if we're going to look at structured ways for most countries on the continent to address these security issues and draw lines to address them, is going to be very, very difficult, and especially with countries have well-established institutions, or countries where their democracies are not strong enough, countries where we have authoritarian regimes. Then, of course, the issue of security and that doesn't come in. To wrap up my initial comments on this, I'm going to say this, that the current developments from the United States is actually also not helping the case. So, for example, if you look at what is happening in Venezuela, it makes it very difficult for you to make a case to talk about, even viewing China as an adversary or as someone to pay critical attention to. When the president of the United States comes and says, "Hey, we're going to Venezuela for the oil and for that," and everyone knows that Venezuela cannot stand the United States, of course, which was proven. Now, African countries also know that they can't pick fights that they can't win, and so might be more interested in staying away from these fights. So, for example, it would have been good to share intelligence on some of these money laundering, anti-money laundering activities that go on, maybe human trafficking, and so on and so forth. But the issue is that they can't even trust countries like the States or countries in the West or even China to protect these data and not to re-engineer and use these data. And so they, of course, decide to close their on these things and then move. The Thabo Mbeki on what was going on African blue seas. I mean, we so much most countries from the West were taken away from the oceans through illegal fishing in our oceans. But literally, even though the report came, it was factual, African countries could do literally nothing. And so this issue is key, and I think that to look at it holistically, we also have ways, as Paul again mentioned, to build the capacity of Africans and African institutions to be able to address some of these security issues that we are talking about so much. And I'll wrap. I'll pause here for a bit. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Aline. So Aline, let me share with you the question that was asked while we were waiting for you to jump back online. In your assessment, which have been the best tools that have been used to address some of the illicit activity, and what are some of the enforcement gaps? We're going to have the two other panelists speak on that, and then we'll double back to you.
Yeah, I want to start off with a story that happened in 2016 in Argentina, because there was a Chinese criminal group called the PSHO that was basically doing extortion of Chinese community, but also laundering money for local gangs. And so local Argentine law enforcement partnered up with their Chinese counterparts, and through information sharing and through basically a joint operation, they were able to take down that group. So I bring this up to say the goal isn't necessarily saying that the Chinese should not, we cannot deal with the Chinese at all, right? But I think Latin American and Caribbean countries need to understand to what extent can they work with their Chinese counterparts on information sharing, intelligence sharing with regard to some of these criminal actors that are operating in their own jurisdictions, without actually then causing unwanted dependencies on those. Or on the flip side, allowing for certain surveillance technology that could then be used or repurposed for surveilling one's own population, right? So that's one concern. The other is the importance of the Chinese diaspora community. Now, I want to be very specific and very clear here. The Chinese diaspora community in many countries in Africa, certainly many countries in Latin America. My family comes from Panama, and Panama has one of the oldest Chinese diaspora populations throughout the Western Hemisphere. They should not be demonized. There should never be this sense that just because someone is a member of the Chinese diaspora community in a certain country, they are therefore an agent of the Chinese state. Not the case at all. In fact, we could be working more closely with the Chinese diaspora, and that this is the importance of the Chinese embassies in various countries to do more targeted outreach to the Chinese diaspora communities, because they, in many ways, are victims of Chinese criminal activities, extortion, the strategic leverage of certain associations within the Chinese community, Chinese friendship associations and stuff like that by the Chinese United Front. Many of them know what's going on, but too often the US embassies in these certain countries do not have the connections and the ties to the Chinese diaspora community to really know what's going on. By the way, this is also an issue of local law enforcement too, right? They don't necessarily have those ties to those communities either, which actually leads me to another suggestion, which is maybe there can be more, as part of US security cooperation assistance to Latin American and Caribbean countries. I suggested this to Senator John Cornyn of Texas and Senator Sheldon Whitehouse of Rhode Island, that we should leverage, say, certain US law enforcement agencies that already have a lot of experience with dealing with Chinese organized crime. So think NYPD, right? Think the LAPD. We already have state partnership programs. We already have certain law enforcement outreach, like the New York Police Department has a connection with, I think, Brazil, and so on and so forth. Well, maybe they can bring some of those officers who speak Fujianese or speak Cantonese in order to share some of their best practices with local people as well. I'll stop there.
Well, this is a very difficult question, but I think I'll break it down in three parts. By the way, before I do that, United States, towards the end of last year, deactivated the second Security Force Assistance Brigade, which had responsibility for training and developing relationships with African military professionals and military forces. So I just want that to sink in. In the context of the earlier discussion, in terms of the formal mechanisms and institutions that the Chinese government has created to ramp up its engagement with African military professionals and military forces. But let me pivot to this question. Conceivably, there will be illicit activity that is just absolutely not good for the Chinese government or any Chinese embassy, as I explained, the former Chinese ambassador to Tanzania, whose account, by the way, very interestingly appeared in the Chinese media as well as international media. So that illicit activity that is not good, that is absolutely not good for the Chinese government, we have seen cases of joint operations. So in Tanzania, there was a joint operation, extensive joint operation between the Chinese People's Armed Police and the Tanzanian counterparts in interdicting somebody that was known as the Ivory Queen, a Chinese national who was highly respected in the country, but who happened to be involved in ivory smuggling. Now, if you read about ivory smuggling in Tanzania, it's on steroids, right? So in that particular case, there was coordination between the two sides. Another example is the joint commando operation between Ugandan and Chinese special forces that apprehended a criminal syndicate that was operating in Uganda and the Democratic Republic of Congo, and it's not clear whether these guys were pursued. It's not clear how many of them ended up in the DRC and whether there was another operation in the DRC. But certainly, the Ugandan operation was very well documented. Some activity may benefit, arguably, it may benefit the Chinese state-owned enterprise. I'll give an example. United Nations documented a case where a Chinese state-owned oil company in South Sudan during the chaos in the country, in order to secure its facilities and to secure its personnel, engaged the services of a militia group in Upper Nile region to such an extent that fuel was provided to this group for the group to then be able to operate and to secure these actions. So obviously, an armed group that is not controlled by the state is obviously illicit. And in this particular case, that illicit group was engaged by a Chinese state-owned enterprise. Now, it's difficult to prove whether that was sanctioned by the Chinese government, whether it was sanctioned by the Chinese embassy, but it was a case of an illicit activity that conceivably assisted a Chinese state-owned enterprise that found itself in a very tricky position. Now, some illicit activity is not contained at all. So when you look at illicit and irregular fishing, illicit and unregulated fishing in West African waters, in East African waters, right? A lot of Chinese trawlers are implicated in that activity, but we don't see any effort, for instance, by African governments. Well, African governments do complain about it, but we don't see any effort by the Chinese escort task groups that are deployed in these waters to apprehend this particular activity. I guess the argument can be made that these are anti-piracy missions. Of course, they do joint training, they do all kinds of things, but they do not monitor that illicit fishing activity. So these are three cases that I would give in terms of how this thing is being addressed.
Thank you.
Or not addressed.
Yeah. Thank you, Bob. Alhin, and then we're going to shift to Q&A. Mr. Alhin?
Maybe it's-
Sir? Okay, so for sake of time, we're going to shift over to Q&A, please, or observations or statements. So if you have a question or a comment, please approach one of the mics. Identify yourself, please. Thank you.
Hello, hi. My name is Wen. I'm a recent graduate student from York University. I had a question about, I guess, terrorism in the Sahel and security issues in that region. Since we've seen the rise of terrorism in West Africa and the Sahel majorly, I understand that for the US and AFRICOM, terrorism in Africa, North Africa, and the Sahel are a part of are important to US security strategy. And particularly, the US has historically have counter-terrorist activities with Morocco, Guinea, Algeria, and Egypt, but not so much in the Sahel. The only thing we've seen recently is the operations, obviously, with Nigeria, the attacks with Nigeria, and then recently troops being sent to Nigeria. I'm wondering if, do you think there will be an increase in counter-terrorist efforts between the US and countries in the Sahel, as well as Nigeria, and how does that affect Chinese security intentions in Africa and the Sahel? And do you think that China would develop or has any incentive to develop counter-terrorist cooperations with West African nations in the Sahel? Thank you.
Please, yes. We'll take two more.
Good afternoon. My name is Roger Rolando Reyes, a recent graduate of American University School of International Service. So my question is basically in terms of the capacity building. I think there's been kind of like a very emphasis on how China is willing to put a lot of its money up front to support partners, whereas the United States doesn't seem to be as equally invested outside of value projection, perhaps. What do you believe, especially as panelists that have been talking about, how closely China is being able to work closely with African and Latin American partners? What is your view in terms of had the United States, for example, repurposed USAID, for instance, to kind of be a similar mechanism to support other agencies in things like law enforcement, for example, or in things like governance and other things like that? Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. My name is Participar de Sola from the Andres Bello Foundation. I'll try to make it brief. hearing to Paul's comments, I think we mentioned this, that looking at what China does in Africa from a Latin American perspective, usually like looking into the future, because usually first happens in Africa, and 5-10 years later we see more or less the same dynamics playing out in Latin America. I think with the exception of probably Leland's work, there's very, very little research or documented work on the cooperation in the security sphere between China and Latin American counterparts. But then again, nothing is really popping up, at least from media, journalism perspective. It's clearly not the case in Africa. But for me, maybe I'm being naive here, but I think it's at the end of the day, these types of links are a two-way street. So because of the historical links between organizations, military organizations like Southcom and militaries across the region, very strong links, very cooperation agreements that are ongoing and have been actually deepening in the last few years. So here's my question, as two questions of this, the two sides of the same coin. On the one hand, why would Latin American countries risk, or what would they have to gain from engaging with Chinese counterparts on a security relationship when they have very strong beneficial links? And we all know that military establishments tend to be very, very conservative. And why would China actually try to push that? Because we've seen that that the U.S. is always an important variable for Chinese decision making, especially in the Western Hemisphere. So what would China actually have to gain by pushing these buttons or red lines of the United States, especially after the shifts we've seen over the last few years? And I think January 3rd and the operation in Venezuela was a very, very clear signal on how far the U.S. is willing to go to protect its interests in the region. Thank you.
Thank you. Paul, Julian? Okay, I think I'll go first. So my sister asked a question about terrorism. Yes, the Chinese are deeply engaged in terrorism and counterterrorism, as defined in Chinese doctrine with African countries, right? There's a formal partnership with the African Union on counterterrorism, and a lot of the military exercises that are done by the PLA Navy, by the naval units that are deployed on these anti-piracy patrols, focus on terrorism, counterterrorism. So there is a counterterrorism partnership that the Chinese have with African countries. Now, when you talk to African officers, they'll tell you that the preference is for European, Canadian, American, because they've had a more direct experience with the sorts of terrorist threats that African countries face, a lot of which exist in the West and also exist in African countries. But nevertheless, again, you go back to what China is able to offer, equipment, training, and at scale and at low cost. My question is, in terms of capacity, when you consider the fact that the Chinese government explains its operations in African waters since 2008 as contributing to maritime safety and security, why have we not seen an African Navy that has participated in this training and these programs do an interdiction? Right? The PLA Navy has done 66 interdictions forcible interdictions since 2008, and has escorted 6,000 PRC flagged vessels and 6,000 foreign flagged vessels since that time. Why have we not seen an African Navy do that, right? So that speaks to the issue of capacity. These are just questions that I ask as a military researcher. Um, my brother from the American Foreign Service Institute.
University.
Yes, yes. You asked a question about. You asked about what did you? What was the question?
The gentleman, from the Foreign Service, from American University.
Yes, yes.
Can you repeat your question, sir?
Sure. It was in terms of the investment. China has made quite a lot of investment compared to the United States, which doesn't seem to have been making a lot. So, we repurposed one of our agencies to do that.
Right. Okay, no, valid question, valid question. I'm not gonna go into the details. But again, I'm gonna go, but I will paint a strategic picture for you, right? Who trains more African students than any other industrialized country? It's the PRC, right? More African students get visas to go to the PRC for bachelor's degrees, graduate degrees, masters, masters and PhD programs than any other industrialized country with the exception of France. Okay? Who trains more African young leaders, in political parties, political movements, civil servants, government workers, journalists, and so on? Again, it's the PRC through the FOCAC mechanism, right? They've got the, Josh is nodding his head. I've worked with him for many years. You have, the China-Africa Journalist Forum, the China-Africa Media Forum, the China-Africa Peace and Security Forum, the China-Africa, whatever it is, just fill it in, right? You have all these junkets, fully paid, subsidized programs, young people of a certain age going into China, receiving training. So it's not just happening on the mill-to-mill and intelligence, paramilitary side. It's also happening on the on the civilian side. Now we can have an argument as to what this training really amounts to, but just in terms of depth, in terms of routinization, and in terms of consistency and systematic focus, the PRC is doing a lot more than anybody else, right? So when you have that picture, and when you talk to the Chinese, as I do when I go to Beijing, I always ask this question: is it about numbers or quality? And the answer I always get is, look, if we invest in, training 200 people, and just 2 people out of those 200 really show an interest in advancing the Chinese model, that is a success. So that's, to answer your question.
Leland, you have the last question.
Yes, so I know that we're already over time, but I do want to mention a couple of things. So one, you're absolutely right. There isn't a lot of research other than, let's say, Evan Ellis, right? And some other, maybe Alonso Ilueca over in Panama, right? But there hasn't been a lot of it. But I don't necessarily think that means that's not happening. I mean, there's already examples in Venezuela, for example, right, where Venezuela has purchased military tank equipment, some missile equipment. There's 2 space research sites in Venezuela, in Luepa and El Sombrero, right? And Venezuela is just one example, right? You've got Bolivia that has examples of having bought Chinese military equipment. Guyana is another example. I think that why would Chinese want to do that? I think one is simple economics, right? In the same way that there's the military-industrial complex here in the U.S., it's the same over in China, right? Norinco, AVIC, and others, they want to open up new markets. And so far, they've seen willing customers in the Venezuelas of the world and Cubas of the world and Nicaraguas of the world, but also to provide strategic options, right? Very much, you see, of course, the U.S. expanding its own influence in the South China Sea and China's near abroad. It's very likely that the Chinese want to provide certain options to restrict U.S. movement in our own region, right? And by the way, that was evidenced in a recent CCTV documentary, right, where it was probably a 15-minute or so documentary, but there was sort of a 1-minute thing showing how the PLA was looking at wargaming, in which they were also looking at the Western Hemisphere as part of that wargaming scenario, right? So this is happening. This is part of the thought process, certainly on the military side. And I think in a recent a recent event that we've been on, I think through the Atlantic Council, I had mentioned this, that it's not necessarily a matter of or a difference in tactic. I think it's a difference of time, right? Chinese engagement on the military and security side in Africa has a 20-year start than with Latin America and the Caribbean, and so I think it's basically ultimately a matter of time. And I think the last thing I'll mention is the Chinese have senior defense officials in their embassies, right? Similar to the way that the US has our SDOs in various embassies. And they are trying on a daily basis to try to get the Mexicans or the Argentines or whatnot to buy their military hardware. And you're absolutely right. With the current administration, the leeway in which they would have had maybe in the past to do that is completely cut off. I'll end with a specific example. I was just in Panama 2 weeks ago, and at the embassy, the Bureau of International Narcotics and Law Enforcement, INL, mentioned that there's a new U.S. visa policy in the Central America, right, which basically revokes visas for anybody who is dealing with anything regarding to the PRC, right? That has apparently struck the fear in the hearts of a lot of people in the Ministry of Security and Senafront and others to say, oh man, maybe we were okay to go to Beijing and get law enforcement training or take a law enforcement class before, or maybe to receive some law enforcement donation equipment, but now they do not want to do that at all, for good and for bad for the local Panamanians.
Okay, thank you. Please join me in thanking our panelists.